Karr of the Free Press, one of the core experts and players in the field of media reform. How did you get involved in the media reform movement? You're a journalist and international communications expert. How media reform? Why media reform?
I got started as a journalist. I was working overseas in the 1990s. I was stationed in Hanoi, Vietnam, writing for Time Inc., which has an Asia publication called Asia Week, and I also started a newspaper in Hanoi that was the first foreign cooperation with the Vietnamese government since the end of the Vietnamese-American War. And at that time, I was publishing in Hanoi, and was hired a bunch of local Vietnamese journalists. But as with working in the media in a repressive regime like Vietnam, I had to deal with censors in order for us to get out. We were doing a weekly newspaper. To publish a weekly newspaper, we were doing it on press in Hanoi. Everything that was written by my core of journalists had to go through a fellow by the name of Mr. Zoom, who was our censor. The Communist Party had positioned him. It gave him an office in our newspaper building. He was upstairs. Everything that they was written and edited, it went up to him, and then it came back to me with Mr. Zoom's red pen slashing through copy, and I would get in fights with Mr. Zoom about the nature of free speech and free press. Very interesting conversations. I was an American, of course, and this was his country, so he had every right, he thought, to censor our work. And I came back to the United States after doing that for 4 years, thinking that we in the United States had a better model for news and information, and I quickly learned that we had our own problems here. One of the things that really began the media reform movement in the United States was when, in 2003, the United States went to war in Iraq based on false premises that were put forth by the then Bush administration. And a part of that problem was that these false premises were then trumpeted and forwarded by a media system, very dominant media system, very powerful media companies that accepted the Bush administration's argument for war, and in fact even published at what they thought was evidence that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and was therefore the case for war was justified. And we've now since learned that all of that was false, and that the press was manipulated in many ways willingly so. So in 2003, my focus shifted from an emphasis on journalism to an emphasis on reforming. Hang on one second. I just see here. To an emphasis on reforming the media, so that kind of problem wouldn't exist. So that we had a media system that actually did the bidding of the public, that served the public interest, and not one that was more interested in serving the interests of very powerful elite. And from that, 2003 was also the year that my organization, Free Press, was born. And we've been around for 10 years now, and we cover a whole range of issues. We look at the issue of quality of journalism, ownership of media, which was really kind of what forged the media reform movement in 2003 and the years after that. But it has evolved from looking at media ownership now to looking at the internet itself and how we protect that network so that everybody's right to connect and communicate without fear of surveillance, without fear of censorship, is protected. And as you probably would expect, it's been a busy 10 years. And it's been very busy in the last year, in particular the last 4 months, when we're now looking at these sorts of attacks on online privacy and that have a chilling effect on free speech, that we're now learning about as Edward Snowden, this whistleblower, has revealed the extent to which the internet network, this supposedly open network, has been compromised by surveillance. And there's a long history of that I can I can go into in more detail.
Mm-hmm. The free press is perhaps the most visible, the powerful, impactful organization in the field of media reform and media justice, however we want to, whatever words we want to use. It started as a US-based organization, but clearly the new problems that you highlighted are implicitly and also very explicitly international. So how do you see the field of media reform evolving, and how will your organization be a part of that development?
Well, I mean, it has evolved. I mean, it has evolved. We've been around for 10 years, as I've mentioned, and it really, the initial focus was on broadcasting issues about ownership of television, ownership of radio stations, and in the last 20 years, of course, the internet has become much more dominant as a form of communication. So it has evolved from the kind of broadcasting model to a broadband model, and it has gone from sort of domestically focused. A lot of our initial work was around media ownership at the Federal Communications Commission, which is the U.S. agency that regulates the use of the public airwaves to hopefully ensure that the stations, the television stations, access to the airwaves for radio stations and broadcasting are serving the public interest. And it's evolved from that domestic broadcasting related to model to something that's more international and related to the internet. Because as people know, the internet is not limited in that way. It doesn't end at national borders. It's an international. People who all over the world who have a broadband connection or have an internet connection hopefully can get online and connect with anyone else. And it doesn't matter whether you're in Siberia or Somalia. As long as you have that connection, you should be able to connect with one another. So that has been the real evolution from broadcasting to broadband, from domestic to international concerns. And in the international space, we're now looking at, how do we keep networks open? How do we protect people against surveillance of their networks or shutdown of their networks? We've seen a number of instances that came out of the Arab Spring and the Iranian Revolution that preceded that by a couple of years, where you have very powerful forces in government attempting to use broadband networks to surveil people, to spy on people, to find their location, to censor content from getting in, and also censor content building firewalls. Like the Great Chinese Firewall that prevents information from getting out, and so it's more of an international discussion, and it's about how do we, as a constituency of internet users, how do we organize and create the political power to protect this wonderful network, this network that allows people, when it works, to communicate in all sorts of ways, and it doesn't again matter where you are. So that has been one of that's been the evolution of the movement, and we've had some recent really interesting things happen. There was a protest in 2012 that mobilized a lot of internet users in the United States to kill legislation that was ostensibly meant to protect copyright owners, but it really, the main way that they wanted to do that was to undermine the network, the internet itself. And so we organized to stop that. We now have a very large coalition of people that are trying to stop the NSA efforts of mass surveillance, something that they're doing both domestically in the United States, but internationally. And so that is a coalition that has global elements to it as well.
How do you work concretely? Can you give a little glimpse, a little example of how the free press goes about mobilizing people, making a difference, lobbying, being in touch with different stakeholders, making your voices heard?
Sure. Well, this may sound a little jargony, but if you ever work for an advocacy organization, one of the phrases that you'll often hear is, "What is your theory of change?" And theory of change essentially means what are the tactics, what are the strategies that you as an organization use to enact reforms, to change things. And at Free Press, our theory of change is something we call an inside-outside strategy, or an outside-inside strategy, which is somewhat unique to our organization, is that we combine both insider expertise and knowledge about media policies and government with outside grassroots organizing. And in the case of Free Press, that means that we have an office in Washington, D.C. that is staffed by lawyers and lobbyists who know the language of government. They know the language of media policy. They visit offices at the FCC. They visit the offices of elected representatives. They help with the drafting of bills. They go to events. They schmooze. They try to persuade, and we have that element. That is the inside element. But we combine that with outside element. We have an office in Western Massachusetts which is mostly staffed by organizers and communicators, people who know how to organize at the grassroots level. They know how to use online tools like email and social media to get more people, to educate people about our issues and engage them in a way where they become activists. And when you have both the inside and the outside working in tandem, you'll have a situation where our lawyers or our people in Washington will say, "Oh, we know that Representative Smith is thinking about sponsoring a piece of legislation that we like, but Representative Smith needs some persuading." And so we'll bring in the outside, and we'll go to Representative Smith's district where we have people on the ground. Free Press has a list of 650,000 activists, and we'll say, call your representative, tell him to support Bill ABC. And so we use that inside intelligence and the access to members of Congress in this case to combine it with grassroots organizing to help move the issue forward. And it by and large, is pretty effective. And it's really a necessary strategy for advocacy groups which don't have the financial resources that a lot of the organizations that we lobby against, a lot of the corporations that we lobby against that spend millions and millions of dollars on lobbyists and campaign contributions, have the ability, unfortunately, to persuade elected representatives in the United States more than lowly advocates like Free Press. So we compensate for that by doing really good organizing outside of Washington and try to bring these issues to people in a way that resonates with them.
A fantastic condensation of what you do. I loved it. What do you think people like us, me not so young, but my colleagues in the course, young scholars doing their research work, just about to enter the field either as experts or researchers, what could we do? What is needed from the sort of scholarly community, in your opinion, at this moment for media reform?
I mean, we need experts. We need people who understand the complexity of public policy, to not be afraid of also getting into the advocacy space. Oftentimes there is this sense amongst academia that you have to rise above the sort of political battles and be objective in a way that doesn't compromise your scholarship. And I know that's a difficult and long discussion that we don't need to have here, but we do need public interest-minded experts in research and academia who are looking at some of these core issues about issues of how, for example, how does spectrum policy promote free speech? How can we create media policy for transitional democracies, or a lot of the countries that are sort of in transition in the wake of the Arab Spring? How do we create media policies that allow for dissident voices to be heard, that promote participation in democratic processes, that promote human rights, that protect people's rights to connect and communicate? There is a real hunger out there in governments, especially amongst the more reform-minded people within governments, to implement policies that promote free speech, that protect internet users against surveillance, for example, and protect journalists. But they don't really know where to begin, and there is a role there, I think, for academics and researchers to really focus on those issues, focus on issues of like better media in transitional democracies, in in developing countries that will help promote free speech, help promote interconnectivity, help promote access to communications, and things like that.
Tim Karr, thank you so much for your time and your wise words, and I'm sure you inspired many of us today. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.